Hi, I'm Glenn Ligon, and I am going to talk to you about uh, three curatorial projects, two that I curated myself and one that I was an advisor on. The first project was called Encounters and Collision at Nottingham Contemporary in the UK in 2015. The second project was Blue Black at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis in 2017. And the last project that I was a curatorial advisor on was Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which was at the New Museum and closed just a couple of weeks ago. That exhibition was originated by Okwe and Razor, who sadly passed away in 2019. So let's get started. I am going to figure out how to share my screen so I can show you a PowerPoint. Yes, I will figure this out. Start share. There we go. And then go to the PowerPoint. Okay. Let us play from the beginning. So that's Okwe and Razor. I met him in 1998. We were on a panel together at a nonprofit called Art in General in New York. And God knows what the topic of that panel was supposed to be about, because Okwe was so brilliant and mesmerizing and charming that even though he was only supposed to talk for 10 minutes, he talked for 30 minutes and nobody cared because he was so fantastic. So that's my first encounter with Okwe. Subsequently, we started working together in the sense that I made work and he put me in some exhibitions he curated. The first one was Documenta, which was in 2002 in Kassel. He was first African-born curator to do that show. Okwe was from Nigeria, but lived a long time in the United States, specifically in New York. Curated shows in the United States, had a position at the Art Institute of Chicago, was also at the San Francisco Art Institute, adjunct curator at International Center for Photography, etc. Okwe was an amazing person, incredibly knowledgeable about art history, incredibly wide ranging in his tastes and interests in artists, particularly championing artists from the continent, from Africa, doing groundbreaking shows on African photography, etc. I was also in a show called Archive Fever, which was at the International Center for Photography. I'm just looking up the date. That was in 2008. And also in his Venice Biennale, which was in 2015. And this is a piece that was at the Venice Biennale, a small band. Now, the funny thing about Okwe was he was incredibly ambitious for himself and also for the artists that he worked with. So when we first started talking about Venice and he invited me to be in it, he asked me a strange question. He said, Glenn, you make neons, can a neon be outside? And I said, well, of course a neon can be outside, you know. He said, good, I have a space for you. But what he didn't say was the space he imagined for me was the facade of the Italian pavilion in the Giardini in the Biennale. And the scale of that facade was such that I made this piece that's, I think, 50 feet long. And as you can see in the image, it covered the sign that said La Biennale. So that was Okwe being ambitious for me to make the biggest neon I've ever made, but also to literally cover the sign of the building, which would tell you something about the curatorial inventions and interventions that were waiting for you inside. So a little detour from working with Oakley. I want to talk about some projects I curated before I joined the curatorial team that did Grief and Grievance, the show that Oakley initiated for the new museum. One of the first curatorial projects I did was Encounters and Collisions. It was in 2015. It was at Nottingham Contemporary, which is a small arts organization in the UK, in Nottingham. And I was invited to curate a show, not because I thought of myself as a curator or wanted to curate a show, but because the director of the Nottingham Contemporary, Alex Farquharson, read a book of my writings and interviews called Yourself in the World. And he thought that that book would be the basis of a good curatorial project. And frankly, I wasn't feeling it. But he sent me a kind of fantasy football PDF of all the artists I had written about or talked about in interviews. And I looked at that PDF and said, well, actually, that's an interesting show. So the show became about encounters and collisions based on a Boetti tapestry of the same name, and about thinking how artists work within a community, that your work doesn't come out of a vacuum, it comes out of encounters and collisions with other artists, work, ideas from other artists, but also the notion of this exhibition was about bringing artists together that I hadn't seen together. For example, Buford Delaney, a Black abstract painter that I admire very much. I had never seen his work in dialogue with Franz Klein, another artist from the same generation, white generation, another artist who I admire, and who Buford and Klein were friends. They knew each other at least in the 50s in Greenwich Village, but I'd never seen their work in dialogue together. So I thought the exhibition was a chance to do that kind of juxtaposition, as well as doing juxtapositions of my work with those of work of artists that I felt like I was in dialogue with. So this is one of the first rooms of the show, my American Neon, in juxtaposition with Felix Gonzalez Torres' piece called America, untitled America on the Floor, one of his Candy pieces, David Hammond's body print on the back, an Encore painting, date painting, and a Joseph Beuys poster documenting his performance, I Like America and America Likes Me, from the mid-70s. Another shot of that room with Mappa by Boetti, Katie Nolan on the floor there, Byron Kim's piece called Synecdoche, and some drawings by Popel. Jackson Pollock on the left, Robert Morris, and one of my text paintings on the right. Klein at the back there, the black and white one, juxtaposed, sorry, the images are so small, of yellow painting by Buford Delaney and a painting by Delaney of James Baldwin. And on the other side of the room, Martin Wong, de Kooning, a Baldwin painting from a series called Stranger that I've done over many years, culminating in a very large painting that will be shown in the United States in November in New York. And another shot, another room with a Klansman painting, Katie Nolan in the foreground, Mel Edwards Lynch fragments on the wall, and photos of the Black Panthers from the 70s. So there's another curatorial project I want to talk about. It's called Blue Black. It was at the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis. The show was, what was this show? 2017. And originally I was invited to the Pulitzer to do an exhibition of my own work. But when I got to the building, which is an amazing Tadeo Ando structure, in downtown St. Louis, I was mesmerized by this Ellsworth Kelly wall relief called Blue Black. It's permanently installed in buildings. So I realized that any exhibition that is done at the Pulitzer, or any exhibition I would do at the Pulitzer, had to be in some ways dialogue with this work. But then I began thinking about an exhibition again. And I said to the curator, well, somebody, this place has been open for 10 years. Somebody must have done an exhibition around the colors blue and black. It's obvious, start with David Hammons and go from there. And she said nobody had done that. And so that became my proposal for the exhibition. So in the space, I put my neon, a small band that was commissioned by Oakley for Venice Biennale, but put it inside on stands. And so you can see that it sort of blocks the main gallery, basically. I mean, it is an artwork and you can walk around it and through it, but it also doesn't quite fit in the space. And that sort of not quite fitting in the space, I think, was an interesting intervention in the space, but also gave me some new possibilities to think about the work and its meaning. And I'll talk a little bit more about the origin of this piece when I show you images from the new museum show. So as I said, the exhibition was called Blue Black, and it was organized around artworks that use the colors blue, the color black, or in combination. So riffing off of the Ellsworth Kelly. So here's a piece by Simone Lee called Dunham, based on a dancer, Catherine Dunham, who grew up in St. Louis. Carrie James Marshall, policeman. A photograph from Carrie Mae Weems's series of photographs with these tinted, beautifully tinted photographs with text. Jack Whitten's self-portrait, and a painting by Lynette Bouaki. Now, what was interesting about working on the show in St. Louis was that this was at a moment in the wake of Ferguson. After Michael Brown's killing, a lot of artists, activists in the city began questioning what the art institutions in the greater St. Louis area were going to do in response to this ongoing tragedy of Black Death, particularly around Michael Brown's death. But it's also in the wake of an exhibition at the Contemporary Arts Museum in St. Louis, which is across the street from the Pulitzer Foundation, an exhibition by the artist Kelly Walker, who had shown images of protesters in a civil rights march in 1964, smeared with a digital representation of chocolate, but also images from a semi-pornographic magazine, images of Black women smeared digitally with Crest or ultra white toothpaste. So at the opening of the show, there was a panel discussion with Kelly and the curator of the exhibition, and several of the artists there, particularly artists of color, were questioning him about those images, the politics behind them, his use of them. And apparently his answers were very dismissive of the questions and very dismissive of the idea that he should be questioned about those images. And so it ensued that there was calls for a boycott of the museum. It got so heated and fraught that the curator actually resigned eventually. So this exhibition I was doing at the Pulitzer was in the wake of that exhibition, but also more generally in the wake of the ongoing protests around Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, and the arts community being very aware of, sensitive to exhibitions happening in the city that somehow ignored some racial reckoning that was going on. And so what I decided to do after talking to, having roundtables, talking to the many artists that I met in St. Louis, who were basically like, don't come down here with no fucked up shit. You're Black, but we're not going to give you a pass. I took that seriously. And one of the things that was really inspiring to me was a meeting we had in the Pulitzer, organized around a big conference table where I talked to a lot of different artists, activists. And the memory of that meeting was very strong with me. So when I actually laid out the first gallery of the show, somehow symbolically, I wanted to recreate that kind of sense of the looks across that table in the meeting I had with folks in the community. So I put the Simone Lee on a pedestal and had it sort of in dialogue with works that were figurative, like the Carrie James Marshall, like the Carrie Mae Weems. So there was a sense of looks across these artworks. So as a viewer, you were kind of caught in this web of Black looks across the galleries from these one artwork to the other. So the Jack Whitten, which is an abstraction, but is a self-portrait. The Black Policeman, which is looking off to the Carrie Mae Weems, while the Simone Lee is looking at the Black Policeman, and the Lynette portrait sort of back turned to the whole scene. And I confess I took this idea from, sorry for the noise outside, took this idea from Lynette Boake's installations. Often she will do installations of her work, which is all these imaginary portraits of people of color. Often in the installations, there'll be a looks between the paintings across the gallery. And so I took this idea of the artworks looking across at each other as a way to sort of nod to these conversations I was having that were very formative to the idea of the show. Another gallery where I did a salon style hanging of works by Bill Traylor, Cecily Brown, Lynette again, Lyle Ashton Harris photograph, Warhol, etc. There was also a strain of abstraction in the exhibition. So you're seeing left to right Jean Moreau, a Jack Whitten painting called Dead Reckoning, and a collaborative work by Stephen Prina and Kelly Walker. Sorry, Stephen Prina and Wade Guyton. Also in juxtaposition with indigo cloth from Ghana. On the other side of the room, Poussette Dart, Norman Lewis, Jenny C. Jones, Eric Mack, and Eric Mack again on the left, and linchpin for thinking about abstraction, linchpin of thinking about anything, really, David Hammond's, one of his tarp paintings. And the last work I'm going to show you from the exhibition, which had about 50 artists in it, is Derek Jarman's film Blue. Which brings me to Grief and Grievance, Mourning in America. Here is the catalog for the show, backwards, but there it is. The show was conceived of by Okwui Enwezor, I think based on a series of lectures he was going to give on the topic of Black grief and white grievance at Harvard. He never gave those lectures because he was battling with cancer up until he died in 2019. So he was in dialogue with the New Museum. The chief curator there is Massimiliano Giorni since early 2018 around this exhibition. And it was always going to be the entire building. And Okwui had, I think, picked probably 85 to 90% of the artists that were going to be in the show, sometimes with very particular work that he wanted in it. And he asked me in the fall of 2018 to be an interlocutor with them, not a co-curator, but someone to be in dialogue with him, to bounce ideas off of. At the moment that he was working on the show, 2018, 2019, up until his death, he was the chief of the the head of the Haus der Kunst in Munich, an arts museum in Munich, Germany. And I think he wanted someone in New York who could be his kind of point person that was not in the museum as such, but who he could have an independent dialogue with and bounce ideas off of in a different way that he had a dialogue with Massimiliano, who was the chief curator, is the chief curator at the new museum. So I agreed to be his kind of interlocutor without realizing how ill he was. So we started talking by phone, email, occasional visits that I would make to Munich about the exhibition. And this was absent talks with, I wasn't talking to Massimiliano, that was up to Oqui, but really Oqui and I were having a dialogue. And about 2 weeks before he passed, I went to Munich to visit him, and it became clear to me the gravity of the situation. When I walked into his room in the hospital that he was being treated at, and he'd been in and out of the hospital for several years, so it wasn't unusual that he was in the hospital. But when I walked in, he, Oqui, very grand, boarding school, custom suits, custom shoes, dashing neckerchiefs, very grand. But there he was, still grand in his hospital robe, being wheeled out of his room as I was walking in. And he said, "Glenn, I'll be right back. I'm just doing this little treatment." And he comes right back, half an hour later, and we literally spend 6 or 7 hours talking about the exhibition, artists that he wanted in it, artists that he wanted to investigate more, sitting in his hospital bed with me at his bedside. He's playing music by the percussionist and composer Taisan Sori. "Glenn, do you know this album, Pillars? It's amazing." Like, "Yes, Oqui, it's 3.5 hours long." But he was really thinking about it and how to incorporate it in the show. Not to have Taishan perform in the show, but how to literally incorporate the album into the exhibition as a sonic element. And he did figure that out. We made a room to sit in while one listened to that album, Pillars. So I think that was one of the things that was interesting about the exhibition, was as Oqui thinking sonically as well as visually about how to put together the exhibition. So this piece, A Small Band, as I said, was commissioned for Venice Biennale in 2015. And the short story of its origin is that in the mid-60s, there was a case in Harlem called the Harlem Six, a group of kids who were falsely accused of a murder, all Black kids. They were taken to the police precinct, beaten, gotten confessions illegally. One of them, Daniel Ham, was beaten so bad that he knew he needed to go to the hospital, but he wasn't bleeding. And he didn't think the police would take him to the hospital unless he was bleeding. So in testimony he gives after he was freed from the police station, he says, "I had to open the bruise up to let some of the bruise blood come out to show them that I was hurt and needed medical attention." But you may know that, open the bruise up to let some of the bruise blood come out to show them, because that is the basis of Steve Reich's composition from 1965 or 66, I believe, called Come Out, where he takes Daniel Ham's words from a recording and focuses in on the part where Daniel Ham says, "Come out to show them." And he repeats that phrase over and over again, first on 1 channel, then on 2 channels, then on 4 channels, then on 8 channels. So he turns this speech into a kind of abstraction. And I'd been listening to that Reich's recording for years without knowing what the source material was about. In fact, in some ways, the composition Come Out, even though it was commissioned as a benefit for the Harlem Six, became more famous than the case itself. And so it was super interesting to read about the case of the Harlem Six and read Daniel Ham's testimony and think about making a piece out of it. But what I also realized was that Daniel Ham makes a slip of the tongue. Instead of saying, I had to open the bruise up to let some of the bruise blood come out to show them, he actually says, I had to open the bruise up to let some of the blues blood come out to show them. Blues blood, not bruise blood. And that slip of the tongue fascinated me because, one, Ralph Ellison says the blues is personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. So the blues is all about injury, being done wrong, being hurt, emotionally, physically. Also about transcendence and stealing away, of escaping. And so that's tied up with the idea of bruising and the blues, the idea of injury, but also the idea of transcendence, and so that combination of words, blues, blood, bruise, became this small band, And I confess I've stolen that title from a chapter in Fred Moten's book, In the Break, where he talks about Billy Strayhorn, the painter, Billy Strayhorn, the composer, lyricist, the painter, Buford Delaney, and Artaud, all being in Paris at the same time, and their connection, imagining them playing as if in a small band, a trio, And so this idea of the trio of these words blinking off and on in unison or discordantly was behind a small band. Okwe never mentioned to me in all of our discussions about the exhibition that he wanted this piece in the show. And so we had a sort of interesting back and forth, Massimiliano, the curator at the New Museum, and I, about whether it was appropriate for me as an advisor to the show to have this neon work in the show. And so we can talk about that in the colloquium, but one of the things that persuaded me to put the neon in the show was an artist friend, Greg Borowitz, saying, you have to think about, does your not including it compromise the integrity of Okwe's vision? And I had to think long and hard about that, but ultimately decided that it did compromise Okwe's vision for the show. So I allowed Massimiliano to include it. So I'm just gonna walk you kind of floor by floor. Hopefully you've all seen the video that the New Museum made that walks through the various galleries. This is the first floor, the entryway. I'm not going to show you all the work in the show, but show you a good deal of it. An installation by Adam Pendleton, wallpaper with silkscreen prints framed on top of it. At the back of the space is Garrett Bradley's film Alane, or Alone, actually. The subject's name is Alane, but the film is called Alone, and it's about a woman dealing with her incarcerated partner that she's decided to marry while he's still in jail, and the repercussions of that for, this long-term absence, that her incarcerated husband is going to, that she's going to endure, but the sentence that he is going to serve, but also it's kind of repercussions for her family. In the foreground is a piece by Tiana Nikia McLaughlin called The Severity of Compassion. It is a device reminiscent of sculpture, reminiscent of the devices they used to calm cattle before the slaughter. Terry Atkins memory jars. They're x-rays of these sort of vernacular forms of memorial, and particularly used in the South, where objects from loved one are glued to the outside of these painted bottles. And what Terry has done is x-ray them, so you sort of see them in their ghostly form. Garrett's film again. Arthur Jaffe's Love is the Message is Death. which Oakwe had seen and was in dialogue with AJ a lot about and wanted it included in the show. Oakwe also was keenly interested in having Basquiat in the show, a particular Basquiat painting called The Death of Michael Stewart. But that painting had just been shown in a big show, the Guggenheim, and we decided to substitute with this painting called Procession. A room with Kerry James Marshall and Simone Lee's sculpture Sentinel. Kerry James Marshall being a great friend of Oakwe's and knew him from his time that Oakwe was at the Art Institute of Chicago as curator. Dawood Bey's Birmingham project, where he's photographed an adult and a child. The child is the same age that one of the 4 little girls who were killed in the 1964 Birmingham bombing of a black church. So the child in the photo is the same age as one of the children killed in that bombing. And then the adult that they're paired with is the age that if those children had lived, they would be now. A film called Alice by Khalil Joseph. You might know his work from a series of an ongoing series called Black News, which is a sort of collage of newsreels and other kinds of footage. He's called collectively Black News, that he keeps updating and changing. This is of the singer Alice Smith, who does a really haunting kind of rehearsal performance, mostly without words, mostly a kind of mourning and wordless kind of humming. Beautiful film. Neri Ward, a piece called Peacekeeper, which Oakwe had seen in the Whitney Biennial and in 2005, I believe. And it was recreated for this exhibition. I hope I'm getting that date right. Let me just check my notes. Anyway, I will double check the date and get back to you. But anyway, so this piece was recreated on Oakwe's talking to Neri Ward about being in the show. In the background, photos by Sable Smith. A project by Jenny Sean Jones, score for Sustained Blackness. Forgive me if I'm getting some of these titles wrong. I don't have a photographic memory. I just have ordinary memory. I'm going to look it up. Score for Sustained Blackness in the Grief and Grievance catalog. And Sable Lee Smith's photographic project, where she's taken Polaroids that are done in prisons, where there are these sessions set up where incarcerated people can take photographs with visiting loved ones. And it's about this sort of documentation, but also about the prison system and how these photographs are sold to families. So this sort of notion of intimacy and family connection in the space of the prison system. Go back. Daniel LaRue Johnson, a piece from 1964 called Freedom Now. And there's a through line of abstraction in the show. There's some other works I'm going to show you a little later on. We can talk about that also in the colloquium. Lorna Simpson piece, a painting of a sort of blue iceberg, the racial sublime, kind of, someone called it. And new drawings by Kara Walker done for the exhibition. Paintings by Ellen Gallagher, which were also in Oakwe's Venice Biennale, where she's dealing with this idea of a colony underwater of based on slaves during Middle Passage who jumped or were thrown overboard, and the idea that they formed this underwater colony in the Atlantic Ocean where they live and thrive. Lorna's painting again. The Astor Gates video performance in an abandoned church in Chicago on the South Side near the Dorchester Project. Carrie Mae Weems, another close friend of Oakley's, whose work he'd been in dialogue with for a long time. Her recreation series, so the funeral of Martin Luther King with Coretta Scott and her daughter at that funeral, and a representation of the protests in Birmingham in '64, where Black protesters were set upon by police dogs. Kevin Beasley, Strange Fruit, the hanging piece there, which has an audio component, microphone picking up sounds of the room. Howardina Pindell painting in the back, and Mel Edwards sculptures called Lynch Fragments. This is Howardina's piece. Let me get the title for you, which I can do that. Nothing's ever quick. It's like the book isn't in alphabetical order anymore. Anyway, get to it. Autobiography, Water, Ancestors, Middle Passage, Family Ghosts, from 1988. Is a Howardina Pindell piece. Kevin Beasley, Strange Fruit, Mel Edwards, Lynch Fragments. A close-up of the Kevin Beasley. Okwe Apokwasili, even though she has Okwe's same first name, they actually never met, but I was thrilled that she could be in the show. She was born in the Bronx and is mostly known as a performer, amazing live performances, but has started to do holographic and video work as installations as well. It's another shot of it. Antoine's Organ, a piece by Rashid Johnson, massive piece that has video components throughout it, and hard to see in this slide, but an upright piano in the middle where every weekend a performer named Antoine would play. Mark Bradford painting on the side there, and let me get you a name. Untitled, but it's based on maps that were about redlining in LA. So it reads as a sort of, massive abstract painting, but it's also it's based on specific information, topographical maps, maps of redlining and segregation. Mark once referred to his work as social abstraction. I think that's a sort of interesting, useful term to think about abstract work in the show, such as Julie Moretu, who you see at the end there, or Jack Whitten's painting in the foreground called Birmingham, which is from 1964. Julie Moretu's paintings, all based on images from the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, or protests in Cairo and Tahrir Square, thinking about those as the basis through which she builds these marks and passages on top of. So there is no separation for her between the politics of the day and their representation and abstraction, the act of making gestures, the small act of making a mark on a scene, and all of the things that implies. Another scene of Julie's paintings. And I think one of the last images here is the Jack Whitten painting, Birmingham, from '64. A little hard to see in the image, but you can see a Black protester, if you look carefully, a Black protester in a news photo being bitten by a police dog at this notorious civil rights march that was attacked by the police and fire hoses in Birmingham in '64. And Oakley really wanted this piece and the Daniel LaRue Johnson Freedom Now as kind of linchpins for the exhibition, which is curious because they're both seemingly abstract work. But I think for Oakley, this notion of social abstraction was very important. He was really interested in abstraction that was trying to grapple with the political, the social history, that doesn't stand outside of the history of its time, and really look to Witten and LaRue Johnson, and also, Howard Union Pindell, Julie Moretu, Mark Bradford, Mel Edwards, figures like that who are working abstractly, who are also dealing with the social climate in which the world they live in, of the world that they live in. The last image I have is Julie Moretu's painting Black Monolith for Oakley and Wazer, Charlottesville. And this is an interesting, sort of encapsulation of something about abstraction because, first of all, it's dedicated to Oakley, which is a sort of fitting tribute, and Julie was very kind to let us put it in the exhibition. But also it's about Charlottesville, and Oakley in his curatorial statement talks about Charlottesville and talks about the rise of the right and this sort of white supremacy in the Trump era, and was thinking about that this is the climate in which this exhibition came about. But also Black Monolith is Julie's acknowledgement of Jack Whitten, who did a series of paintings called Black Monoliths, which were tributes to Black figures that were important to him, such as Miles Davis or James Baldwin, which he made abstract kind of portraits of over, I think, the course of 15 or 20 years. So Julie's referencing this history of abstraction, as well as Oakley's presence as a curator in the art world, as well as the events of Charlottesville. So that's all I have. But one of the things I think we could talk about in the colloquium, besides the article by Hannah Black, which makes some interesting points about the difference between mourning and grief, and talks about exhibition making in the time of social unrest, and sort of the idea that museums can't keep up with that. And I agree with her, but I think maybe her critique in that article, I disagree with how it's framed, but I agree that museums in some ways are very slow in terms of their ability to respond to moments. But I think also the difficulty of working on an exhibition when the originating curator isn't around to intervene in that exhibition, because exhibitions for me come through dialogue with artists. Oakley didn't have an idea and then find artists to illustrate it. Oakley's idea came from talking to artists about what they were making, what they were thinking about, and the exhibition formed around that. So we can talk about that. We can talk about this sort of notion of social abstraction. But we can also talk about something that's a little hard to represent in a Zoom lecture, which is the sonic component of the show. On each floor, Oakley was very careful to have some, sonic component there. So on the top floor, Antoine's organ, literally, the sculpture by Rashid Johnson literally has a piano in it that's played, and also videos that have sound and music in them. On the second floor, there is Charles Gaines' piece, which has a piano score that he's written. There's Oakley Apoquasili's piece, which has a ritual chanting in it. There is Khalil Joseph. There's Garrett Bradley has a soundtrack in her video, the Arthur Jaffa. So all throughout the exhibition, on every floor, you're hearing not only sound if you go into particular rooms where there are pieces that have sound, but because of COVID, because of the inability to block off rooms, close them off with curtains and things like that because of COVID, the sound bleeds much more than it would in a traditional exhibition where they would try to block that sound off. And I think that that's something that even before COVID, because we kind of didn't live through the pandemic, but Oku was thinking about sound bleed in the Venice Biennale, in that he had a room in the center of the Italian pavilion called the Arena, and there were performances happening all the time in that room. And the sound from those performances bled out into the surrounding galleries. And so I think Oku was thinking about, the exhibition, as I said before, sonically and visually. Well, thank you. And I will talk to you all in the colloquium. Thanks so much.